The study out of Denmark, which included 8,221 men who had lost a child to abortion. And of those men, up to a 4.5 times greater likelihood of seeking mental health professionals if you've lost a child to abortion.
Welcome to Straight Talk on Life Issues. It's great to be with you. I'm Victor Nieves, president of Life Issues Institute. The evidence is clear. Abortion leaves lasting emotional and psychological scars that many men and women silently carry for years. The topic of abortion and its impact on mental health is unfortunately rarely discussed openly, but it represents a silent epidemic affecting millions of men and women. Recent studies and long-term research reveal a troubling connection between abortion and an increase in mental health struggles. Today on Straight Talk on Life Issues, we're going to talk to Dr. William Lile and Sean Corcoran about the link between abortion and negative mental health. Joining us first is Sean Corcoran. He serves as the CEO of Men for Life, the world's only consistently pro-life organization focused specifically on the inclusion of men in human rights discussion and the conversation surrounding abortion. We're also joined by Dr. William Lile, known as the Pro-Life Doc. He's board certified in obstetrics and gynecology and has personally delivered more than 5,000 babies. Dr. Lile founded Pro-Life Doc Incorporated and dedicated his life to stopping abortion. Sean and Dr. Lile, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much.
And thank you for having me as well.
Well, Dr. Lile, I'm curious, why do you think it is that despite the evidence, the topic of abortion and mental health is not often spoken about?
Well, first, it's a spiritual attack, and we have to realize this is not a choice. And one of the reasons is that we only look at the domestic literature. When you look at the European literature, you look at the Asian literature, the South American literature, it's pretty consistent and pretty obvious that a previous abortion or elective termination of pregnancy has impacts on both depression, anxiety, suicide, and these can last for decades. In fact, about the only domestic literature we have is from the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which with their study shows that depression goes up 35%, anxiety 34%, suicide rates go up, and this happens decades later, and that's consistent with the worldwide literature. The bias comes in from the Academy of Psychiatry, the Academy of Psychology, which will say that there is absolutely no association between mental health disease and a previous abortion, which is not consistent with the worldwide literature.
So, Dr. Lile, let's park on that for just a second. If you don't mind, unpack a little bit as to why here in the United States, this literature is maybe ignored compared to the rest of the world.
This is just a goal that the pro-abortion industry here in the United States has. When you even look at ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, this is the governing body for which 60,000 people have gone through their board certification program under obstetrics and gynecology. And the majority of us have spent a total of 12 years in training between undergrad medical school and then our residency training with two primary goals: healthy moms, healthy babies. But it's that same organization, ACOG, which also has a fellowship called Complex Family Planning. This is a 2-year fellowship where after 12 years of training, you spend an additional 2 years with two primary objectives. Number one is you learn how to perform a late-term abortion. And number two, you have the skills and you're taught how to perform what's called a selective reduction, where if a mom is pregnant with, say, triplets or quadruplets, and I've delivered both triplets and quadruplets, but you are trained how to reduce from 4 maybe to 2. You do that by using an ultrasound to guide a needle through the skin of the mom, through the wall of the uterus, and then maybe pick baby A or baby C and inject that baby's heart directly with either potassium chloride or digoxin. So those will stop the baby's heart, kill that baby and allow another baby or two to live. So this is just an attack on the image of God. It's very prevalent. And even when you look at the evil in our society, in the medical organizations, you look at the American Academy of Pediatrics and Gynecologists, who are there so vehemently pushing, despite the evidence that shows it causes harm, but they continue to push for gender reassignment surgery and corrective surgery for kids in their teens. And we're seeing that obviously these kids, the first thing we see on the data, it was that when they go through this procedure, it will double their risk of suicide. There's no other procedure that we offer at all, which we know this is going to double your risk of suicide, but they are standing by it. They're, using hormone therapy on these kids and even permanently surgically changing their lives from what they were created in at that moment of conception. So this is just an attack on the image of God. And that's the real key. We're created in the image of God. An abortion and gender reassignment ideology is an attack on that image of God that formed at that moment of conception.
So, doctor, do you think that this is largely a financial motive? What would be their incentive to do this? Because to the average person, it's barbaric.
Oh, I think you can just look at Genesis 1:26 and, where scripture says that we are, let us make man in our image. So at its core foundation, just like somebody who burns the American flag, well, why would somebody burn the American flag? I mean, I live here in Pensacola, home of the Blue Angels, delivered 5 of the Blue Angels babies, but why would somebody burn the American flag? Because the American flag is the image which represents the United States of America. So out of a hatred for the United States, people will want to destroy the image which represents the United States, which is the flag. The same thing is true when it comes to the baby in the womb. They are created in the image of God at that moment of conception. So abortion at its core foundation is an attack on that image of God out of a hatred for God. And what's going to make the change is when somebody, and they will, a young person will successfully either sue a hospital or a hospital system. They'll be awarded over $100 million because this is an attack on these kids. A lot of them are minors when they go through this surgery. Their parents did not do their due diligence to stand up for them, and the hospital did not do their due diligence to stand up for them. And now we have states where if a parent does not affirm the gender to which that child who is confused identifies, those parents can actually lose custody of their own children. I just absolutely would not live in that environment where the state would come in and take my child because my child is confused, mostly through social media influence. I mean, teenagers are confused about lots of things, but when we are permanently changing them for life surgically and with injected hormones, that is evil. That is not healthcare.
Certainly. Well, doctor, what are some of those specific impacts, the effects of abortion on men and women? And then have you experienced anything that would indicate that that's different between men and women?
Well, let's face it, every single pregnancy involves a guy, and Sean can speak to that in a little bit. I mean, there was one pregnancy 2,000 years ago that didn't involve a guy, but that was a one-off, and it hasn't happened again since. But every pregnancy involves a guy, and a lot of guys didn't even know that their girlfriends were pregnant, especially with the women now getting the abortion pill. A lot of times, her best friends don't know she was pregnant. Her parents don't know that she was pregnant. Nobody knows, but she knows that she was pregnant. And if your daughter has a cell phone, she has access to the abortion pill. And she doesn't even need to have a credit card. There are organizations all across the country which will provide at no cost to you the abortion pill. Now that we've been using the abortion pill for so many years, you have a lot of people who have now taken positions in churches. They might be a pastor's wife. They might be in leadership in a church, and nobody knows that they are dealing with an abortion. I've read the testimonies of dozens of women who can look back on their mental health challenge journey and say that the inciting event which started this whole journey into their mental health challenge was when they had an abortion 20, 25 years, 30 years previous to that. These people are hurting, both men and women. They need healing. Healing comes from forgiveness, and true forgiveness only comes through Christ. So the real key is we need to at first ask the questions as far as how many times have you been pregnant, and let's go through your whole OB history. And when we do realize that 18 to 24% of all the men and the women that attend church at least once a month have personally been involved with an abortion, a lot of times the counselors and the pastors are surprised by the percentage of people who have been dealing with this for decades. And we see this in men and we see this with women. And we need to ask the question in order to bring counseling that they need, but also in order to bring the gift of salvation, which will bring healing after abortion.
Well, Sean, let's jump to you. Briefly tell us your story and then how abortion impacted your mental health.
Yes. So I lost my first child to abortion when I was 19 years old. I was in college. I was not prepared for that. And it led me to fail out of college. And what's interesting about this is that it did affect the mental health of the young lady as well. She let me know that as she was struggling in school, that she had gone to these counselors at school and shared with them, this is what's happening. And they had waived some of her classes so that she would be able to keep her grades up and not affect her academic standing. So I took that and went to the same people, the same person, shared that I was in the same situation with this young lady and that it was affecting my grades as well. And the counselor said, well, this isn't about you. This can't affect you. This is not something that we can do anything about because it's not you. And so there was a recognition by the counselors at school that this could affect the mental health of the young lady, but there was a denial or rejection of the idea that could also affect the mental health of the father. And it did. I failed out of college. I moved home. I failed out of college 2 more times. I went on to engage in all sorts of behaviors in an effort to change the way that I felt in my life. And by 2005, I was at the end of a 7-year methamphetamine addiction, homeless, unemployed, overdosing in a hotel room and waiting for the police to come and arrest me. And it wasn't until I got into treatment that the counselor in treatment stopped me and said, hey, we should talk about this. And that was the first time that somebody said we should talk about this, because the last thing that I was told was that it doesn't affect me. So during that entire period, like Dr. Lile said, we talk about depression and we say, hey, what's happened in your life recently? And it can be something that happened in years past. For me, it was 8 years before I got in front of that counselor, before she said, hey, we should talk about this abortion. And objectively looking at it, I went from here, I can't see me on the radio, but like I got my hand up, right? I'm on an upward trajectory, and then I crashed and nothing else happened. Nothing else happened in my life. But in my mind, there was no connection between the abortion and the destructive behaviors because I was told that it didn't affect me. And the reality is that it does affect men. I know that there is, Dr. Lile referenced the studies out of Europe and, socialized medicine. From my personal perspective, I'm not a big fan, but from a data perspective, it provides amazing data. And, the study out of Denmark, which included 8,221 men who had lost a child to abortion. And of those men, what they found was, just to shorten this, there's a lot of data there, but what they found was up to a 4.5 times greater likelihood of seeking mental health professionals if you've lost a child to abortion. Between 74% and 90% increased likelihood of requiring prescription anti-anxiety medications, prescription sleep aids, and prescription antidepressants. And there's the same data exists for women, but you've asked about men. And so I think that if we're willing to accept the fact that this does affect men to the point where we're willing to look at the information that is available to us in an objective standpoint, we can see that it's real. It has to be a complete denial of the effect or the impact on men in order to reject this information as it exists.
And Sean, going back to your story in college of how you were just completely dismissed, this may seem like a silly question. Do you think that that's an experience unique to you, or do you think that's an experience shared by thousands of young men?
No, I think it's millions. We know that 1 in 5 men will lose a child to abortion by the age of 45. Like Dr. Lile said, 18 to 24% of the people in your church abuse, but even outside of the church, that number is very consistent, right? Inside, outside, everyone at the supermarket, 1 in 5 men will lose a child to abortion by the age of 45. So I think it's just a complete societal rejection of the idea that abortion impacts men. And just to give you an anecdotal story about this impact, like I work in a pro-life organization focused on men, right? I speak around the country on the impact of abortion on men and how abortion affects men. I was asked to speak several weeks ago at a men's conference by people who knew that I did this and spoke about abortion. And I was conflicted on what I should talk about and whether I should speak to these 200 men about abortion, because men don't talk about abortion, right? So even on the pro-life side, this idea that abortion doesn't affect men has become so prevalent that for me, someone who speaks about this for work and was hired to speak about this to men, I was still conflicted about whether or not I should speak about it. And so I think that the dismissal is just extremely prevalent. I think it's just become a societal acceptance, right? That we just accept it as a society. And that's really what the work, one of the three tenets of the work that Men for Life is doing right now is trying to break through, is to share the message that, hey, this is not a women's issue. I get it. Like, we've been told for 53 years by the pro-abortion side, this is a women's issue, stay out of it. We've been ignored or overlooked, I should say, by the pro-life side while focusing on women and babies. And no one's been saying, hey, men, this affects you too. And we've accepted it. It does affect men. And if men are suffering in their mental health, then they cannot be everything to their families, their wives, their children, their communities. They cannot fully serve God. They cannot fully serve anyone if they are not their whole selves, because they're constricted, whether it's depression or anxiety or lack of sleep or all these issues. We have to be able to release that in order to allow men to fully serve their communities and be the leaders that God put us here to be.
And ignoring the pain of these men is going to do them a tremendous, tremendous disservice. As we've spoken about today, the impacts, the damage of an abortion, that can last for a lifetime. Sean, tell us about your healing journey after abortion.
So my healing journey began in that treatment center, right? When she said, hey, we should talk about this abortion and the impact that it had. And I did. And then, I was able to kind of let it all out. And the things that we do when we help men and women to heal are things like, naming our child, the humanity of that child. And so I named my child Michael, to write letters asking for forgiveness from the child, from my younger self, to forgive my younger self, to forgive the mother of my child. That was the beginning of my healing journey. And again, what they didn't tell me in treatment, and this kind of goes to this topic of men and mental health and abortion, is that I was not the only one. So even though she gave me permission to heal, right? And even though I was able to set that part of what I was going through aside, so I could also heal from the addiction and from all of the destructive behaviors, that's where my focus was. So I got out of treatment and I went back to school, and I went to law school, and I got married, and kind of set that aside as this is something in my past that I was still too frightened to talk about. And because it was so bad. And so the only people that knew for 8 years after treatment were the mother of my child, my wife, my current wife was not the mother. Let me separate those two people. The mother of my child, her mother, my father, the counselor, and then my current wife. And I was on a retreat, and this is where my healing really took off. I was on a men's retreat, and men were sharing all of these stories about their lives, right? All these things that had happened, and whether they were responsible for them or whether things happened in their lives or whatever they may be, but they were just being very vulnerable. And these men were all generally older than me, and I respected them, business owners, I knew them. And so I just felt really safe. And I felt like this is somewhere I can finally let this out. I've been holding on to this, and I can finally just let it out, and nobody's going to judge me. And I did. And that was very healing. But what happened next showed me that it wasn't about me, and it was more healing. And it's 3 different men, and this is 50 men total, right? 3 different men came up to me after I shared privately and said, I haven't told anyone this in 20 years or 30 years. But I lost a child to abortion. And that happens every single time I talk, whether it happens on social media posts and I'll get DMs. It happens, sometimes it'll happen on social media posts and I'll get public comments. But every time I speak, to the point where now I say that when I'm speaking, letting them know that I know that someone's going to come up to me, and at that men's conference that I referenced, there was 5 different men, and not all of them said, I've never told anybody this. But 5 different men that came up to me afterwards to share their story. And so that's what I need. There's some great retreats, and I'm happy through Men for Life or through personally to connect anyone who has questions about that to some amazing people who are doing healing retreats for men or women and for couples. For me right now, sharing my story and allowing other men to hear that and to be able to release that for their own lives is how I'm healing.
Dr. Lile, with all of the information, the evidence that we have pointing to the very clear destructive impact that abortion has on the mental health of both men and women. What's your message specifically to the American medical community that continues to try and ignore it?
Follow the data. And that's a real thing. We heard follow the science all through the COVID. And yes, we need to follow the science. And science was created by God. Science is one of those tools. I mean, when we look at the science, this is a genetically different person from that moment of conception. Half the time, this baby is a different gender. A lot of times, this baby even has a different blood type from the mother. Follow the science. This baby is genetically unique at that one cell stage from the other 8 billion people on the planet. But we also need to follow the science when it comes to abortion. When it comes to abortion, during the early part of pregnancy for women, there are huge hormone changes. Progesterone levels go up, estrogen levels go up, prolactin, oxytocin, all these hormones which produce a nurturing effect. And a woman, as soon as she becomes pregnant, the first thing she always does is she figures out how far along am I? When did I get pregnant? When's my baby due? And once you have that ideal as far as when your baby is due, and that is a date that will permanently stick within your brain. So the body knows that it's pregnant, and there are changes going on, not only emotionally and psychologically, but physically and as well in the woman's body. And then when that's abruptly stopped, it makes a huge change. And change is something that affects our mental health. Maybe a sense of loss. You lost a parent, you lost a grandparent, maybe you lost a spouse or even, God forbid, a child. That's a huge change which can affect our mental health. Well, there's a huge change when it comes to the loss of a baby. That baby isn't just two lines on a pregnancy test. This is an individual. It was either not going to be or going to be a girl, but it was a boy and it was a girl from that moment of conception. Even when you look at Luke chapter 1, where Mary traveled to visit Elizabeth. And I just recently went through study, realized that was an 80-mile trip when Mary went to go visit Elizabeth. And there are a couple key passages in Luke 1 where Elizabeth says that the mother of my Lord would travel to see me. Not the mother of the baby who's going to be my Lord, but the mother of my Lord. He was the Lord there on the inside. And then even how Elizabeth said baby John the Baptist in her womb leaped in his mother's womb for joy. Now, Luke was a physician. For him to be inspired by the Holy Spirit, that not only did the baby just move, but the baby leapt for joy in the mother's womb, expresses that emotion. So from a medical and psychological standpoint, this is an individual which we treat as patients. All patients have rights, and even the most liberal person will say that a patient has rights. So we will often ask, are you an advocate and supporter of patients' rights? And everybody says yes. Are you an advocate and supporter of patients who weren't born in the United States? Now they get real defensive. They go, well, of course I am. Well, then you also need to be an advocate and supporter of patients' rights who are not born in the United States yet. And that little three-letter word is huge because we are now giving life-saving blood transfusions to babies in the womb as early as 18 weeks gestation. We are doing open heart surgery on babies in the womb where we're removing cardiac tumors, and the baby has its own IV and its own anesthesiologist, and we're doing that at 27 weeks. We're now doing vascular brain surgery. Spina bifida corrective surgery is in its third generation. We're even doing laser surgery for twins when they are sharing one placenta, but they're not sharing it equally. So we can actually go inside of the womb with a laser, and we can actually divide the laser in two, saying this is your side of the placenta, this is your side of the placenta. So these are patients within the womb. All patients have rights, and whenever you lose the life of any patient, there is a huge sense of loss, which is genuine and it is real. And a lot of people have been deceived and they've been told, well, it was just a miscarriage. Miscarriage is one thing because about 20% of all abortions will lead to a miscarriage, but you have a huge sense of loss. My wife and I, two wonderful daughters, but we had 4 miscarriages along the way. So when somebody loses a child, say 3 months old, the church functions like the church should, and the church will send cards, say I'm praying for you. They'll bring more lasagna to fill a freezer. But when somebody at the church knows that somebody had a miscarriage, we don't have that response. In fact, my heart went out to my wife. We had one woman who came up and say, well, at least you know you can get pregnant. And we had another one after we had had two miscarriages and one daughter. She said, well, at least you have Sydney. It's like we're going through that same loss that anybody would go through. So we need to hear that sense of loss, of why it's a sense of loss from our pulpits. When it comes to abortion, this should not be an issue which is being led by politicians and obstetricians speaking from podiums. This needs to be our pastors and priests, which are speaking from their pulpits, because this is bottom line a spiritual battle. When something doesn't make sense medically, you think, why? And then you realize this is a spiritual battle. This is a demonic attack on men and women in the image of God within the womb.
Well, Sean and Dr. Lyle, what would you say to men and women who have experienced an abortion in their past? Sean?
The first thing that I would say is that you're not alone. I think that's huge. I think that people need to have that connection and understand that they're not alone. One of my goals is to not only share my story, but to share stories of other men who are willing to share, because I believe that the more those stories are shared, and women as well, the more those stories are shared, the more people are going to be willing to share their own stories and to know they're not alone. I think that connection is huge for mental health. I think that suffering in silence and solitude is destructive. And then I would say there are resources. There are, like I said earlier, Men for Life is right now focused on reaching the young men in unplanned pregnancy on the front end, stopping the abortion from happening and stopping future abortions. But the next step in our work is healing for men. And the reason that we prioritized that way is because I've met so many people in the healing industry who are doing amazing things for men and women, and like I said, couples. So, and I'm happy to talk to anyone. I'm happy to connect them with the right person based on their story. But the big thing is, just like anything else that happens, like holding it in isn't helping. Like, you got to let it out, and there's a safe place to let it out. And the first thing you need to know is that you're not alone.
Dr. Lyle, what would you add?
Well, we've had over 60 million abortions here in the United States each since 1973. And so 60 million, that really is 120 million men and women. We understand that you are hurting and there is healing. Healing is through forgiveness, and true forgiveness is only available through Christ. And this is really something that needs to come from the church. We had a gentleman, we spoke at a men's ministry. You think, well, pro-life doc? Yeah, prolifedoc.org speaks at men's ministries as well. And we had about 100 different individuals that were there. And we had one gentleman come up afterwards, and we had shown pictures of the practice that I had taken over in 1999. We showed the stairs where thousands and thousands of women had walked upstairs to have their baby aborted in the womb. And there was a gentleman who came up and he said, I know those stairs. I was at your office 2 years before you took it over in 1999. He says, I was there because my 17-year-old daughter said, Daddy, I'm pregnant. He didn't know what to do. He just knew he was supposed to be supportive. She was going to the University of Alabama in the fall, so he actually drove her to what became my office when it was still an abortion practice. Because she was underage, he had to sign the consent because she was a minor. He said, we didn't use credit cards back then, so I got out my checkbook. I wrote a check for $250, and he says, I signed my name a second time. We went, did an ultrasound. He said all he remembered was a black circle and something flickering on the inside. He goes, Dr. Lyle, that was my first grandchild. His daughter went up the stairs. He saw her go up the stairs that I had shown a picture of, and she came back forever a changed woman. He said she, stopped her relationship with God. She stopped going to church. She stopped her relationship with me. He says, I still barely speak to my daughter. He said, for decades, I have sat in church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday, and not once have I heard that abortion is wrong, but it's something that can be covered by the blood of Christ. Paul said, forget about those things which are behind and press on towards what's ahead. He said, for the first time, I just quietly repented of what I had done. He says, I know that there will be a permanent effect. He says, not only was that my first grandchild, he said, that was my only grandchild. I will never have a grandchild. He says, I understand when they talk about sins that'll, affect you for generations. But he said, for the first time when you were speaking and talking about forgiveness, I quietly prayed and I just said, God, I screwed up. I was blessed with a grandchild and now I've lost my grandchild and my daughter. And I just repent of that. He says, I know this was something that was covered by the blood of Jesus already. But he said, for the first time, I feel relief because I repented from that. And he said, I'm a little bit angry at my church. He says, I'm there 3 times a week. Not once have I ever heard a message coming from the pulpit that abortion is wrong, but it is something that can be forgiven and there is healing available. And so he says that needs to be coming from our church. And I agreed. So with 120 plus men and women that this personally affects them and their life, there is healing, and that needs to come through the gospel. Yes, it's great to have a Christian counselor who understands, but let them know why you are having the depression, why you are having the anxiety, because they need to be able to really focus, just like Sean was talking about, how we need to be able to focus on why you are having these symptoms, and they are real, and we understand they're real, but healing is available.
Well, final question to both of you gentlemen. If you could speak to a man or a woman who is right now considering an abortion, what would you say to them? Sean?
So my response would be different for each. I actually did speak with a woman last week, and what I recognized was I'm not in a position. I connected her with a woman, so that would be the first thing I would do, is connect her with the right person to speak to her heart and her experience. When it comes to men, look, my message is simple. Abortion is the product of failed masculinity. The reason that there is nothing weaker than for a man to tell a woman, I support you killing my baby because I don't want to step on your choice. Like, and that's not how they say it, right? We've been told to say, your body, your choice. This isn't our issue. This is a women's issue. Support what she's going to do. And that's the most supportive thing. And the reality is that's the least supportive thing, because what a woman hears is, I'm going to be all on my own. You can't make a decision about this. It is literally failed masculinity. And so you are failing as a man. And that might not be the spirit of compassion. And honestly, I'll give the spirit of compassion and forgiveness on the back end of that. But on the front end, like, men need to hear a message of what it means to be a man, and how is this affecting whether or not you are acting as a man if you are going out and supporting this, because we're not victims, right? Like, men aren't victims in this. Just like Dr. Lile said, if 60 million babies have died to abortion, there's been 120 men and women. That means 60 million men were responsible for the creation of that baby, and many times it's out of wedlock. But that's our choice. Like, we as men made that choice, just like the woman did. This is not a women's issue. We made that choice to engage in acts to create babies. And that comes with responsibility. And it is incumbent upon us as men to take responsibility for our actions. And that means to take responsibility for that young lady and to take responsibility for that baby in whatever capacity that means. But the answer is not to kill a child in order to escape responsibility.
Dr. Lile, what would you say?
Well, pregnancy is a beautiful thing, and it is an absolute gift to both the woman and the man. When it comes to the woman making that correct decision to continue with her pregnancy, the guy is a huge influence in that. When he's supportive, it is very likely that she will be supportive of that. We understand that when you are pregnant for the first time, you've never been in this situation before. And maybe if you could change the events from 2 months previously, you could, but conception has already happened. Reproduction has already occurred. Now it's just a matter of time for this baby to develop and then to be delivered. There sadly were over 2,000 suicides that were performed over the Golden Gate Bridge. They just spent over $200 million on a net system hoping to prevent these kind of suicides. And there were also 29 men and women who walked out onto the Golden Gate Bridge and jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, but by some miracle, when they, hit the water, they survived. They were either fished out by fishermen, the Coast Guard, or they swam to shore. So there was a psychologist who said, oh my gosh, 29 people survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. She interviewed every one of those 29 people, men and women, and her thoughts were, what were going through your mind when you walked out onto that bridge? And they had similar stories. Nobody loves me. Nobody cares for me. Nobody understands my situation. Nobody's here to help me out of this situation that I found myself in. And then they jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge. They fell over 200 feet, and they fell for 2.75 seconds, and they hit the water at blazing speed. And then she wanted to know, well, since you were a survivor, what was going through during the 2.75 seconds of you falling? 29 of 29 had immediate regrets, and they cried out to God. They go, I don't want to die. And by some miracle, they hit the water and they survived. And I think the same is true with women and men who are involved in an abortion. That seems like this is the answer. This is my way to change this situation. But then immediately afterwards, and sometimes it can be even decades of pain afterwards, they realize this was the wrong decision, and they repent, and that healing does come through the gospel. So that is something that is available for men and women. If you are pregnant now, there are over 2,500 pregnancy resource centers that are specifically in all 50 states to help you through this. They have financial resources, they have counseling, they have ultrasound to let you see that it's not just 2 lines on a pregnancy test. This is a baby that already has a heartbeat, fingers and toes growing in the womb, and this is a blessing. And even as far as changing minds, I'm one of the medical advisors for the Abortion Pill Reversal Network. And yes, the abortion pill is what is killing 70% of the babies in the womb today. But we have a narrow window of about 72 hours where we can safely and effectively reverse the effect of the abortion pill. I've attempted this 26 times and we've been successful 19 times. And just last month, we have over 7,000 documented reverses of the abortion pill.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for having me as well.
Well, as we've discussed today, abortion very clearly has a negative impact on the mental health of men and women, something that we know is a plague in this country where so many millions of people are suffering from depression, anxiety, and etc. We know that abortion is not an answer. It's not a solution, despite what the abortion industry may say to men and women in a time of tremendous uncertainty and fear. They'll present it as if it's a solution, but as we've discussed today, we know that it is not. And it's good to hear from Dr. Lile about the medical information we see from not just the entire world, but even here in the United States, information that is unfortunately being ignored and covered up by our medical institutions. To you, our listener, I want to encourage you to go to our website, lifeissues.org, where you'll find more information about abortion's negative impact on people's mental health so that you can fight back, stand for life, share that information with your friends, your family members, your church community, so that together we can create a culture of life and stop abortion. Be sure to tune in next week for another Straight Talk on Life Issues.